The moss-draped oaks of Savannah, Georgia, have a way of holding on to secrets, their long gray tendrils swaying in the humid breeze like ghosts of the past. For Evelyn Vance, standing at the edge of an open grave in the historic Bonaventure Cemetery, the world felt as though it had been drained of all color. The torrential downpour of a southern storm hammered against the black silk of her umbrella, a relentless rhythm that matched the throbbing ache in her chest. Beside her stood Julian, her only son, his head bowed in a posture of grief that Evelyn wanted desperately to believe was genuine. And next to him was Tiffany, his wife of 10 years, whose waterproof mascara remained impeccably intact, her eyes scanning the crowd of mourners not for shared sorrow, but for status. Arthur Vance was gone. A brilliant architect, a man who built skylines and restored history, had been silenced by a sudden massive heart attack in the middle of the night. As the casket was lowered into the red Georgia clay, Evelyn felt 32 years of marriage being buried with him. She remembered the way Arthur's hands, calloused from drafting and wood-turning, would wrap around hers every morning. He was her anchor, her protector, the man who had built their life with the same precision he used for his blueprints. "It's time to go, Mother," Julian whispered, his hand firm on her elbow, guiding her toward the waiting limousine. There was a subtle urgency in his voice that Evelyn, in her fog of grief, didn't quite register. The Vance estate, a sprawling Victorian masterpiece on Gaston Street, felt cold as they entered. The high ceilings, usually filled with the scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco and Evelyn's jasmine candles, now echoed with a hollow silence. As Evelyn sat in the parlor, still clutching her damp lace handkerchief, the atmosphere shifted. The mourning period, it seemed, had a very short expiration date for the younger generation. "We've been looking at the books, Evelyn," Tiffany started, skipping the pleasantries. She didn't call her mom anymore. The shift in address was like a cold splash of water. Tiffany sat across from her, crossing her long legs, a tablet already open in her lap. Evelyn looked at her son. Julian was staring at a point on the Persian rug, refusing to meet her eyes. "The books? Arthur just passed away 3 days ago, Tiffany. I haven't even received the death certificate." "Which is exactly why we need to be proactive," Tiffany countered, her voice sharp and clinical. "Arthur's firm has been hemorrhaging money for years. Projects stalled, lawsuits pending. He kept it from you because he didn't want you to worry. But the reality is grim. This house is a liability. The property taxes alone are astronomical, and the maintenance on a 100-year-old structure, it's a sinking ship." Evelyn felt a tremor in her hands. "Arthur told me we were fine. He said the house was our legacy." "Arthur was a dreamer, Mom." Julian finally spoke, though his voice lacked the strength of conviction. "But he was old school. He didn't adapt to the new market. We've done the math. If we list the house now, while the Savannah market is peaking, we can clear the debts and have enough left to settle you comfortably." "Settle me?" Evelyn asked, her voice a whisper. "We found a wonderful active senior community in the suburbs," Tiffany said, sliding a brochure across the mahogany coffee table. The glossy photos showed smiling white-haired couples playing pickleball. "It's gated, it's safe, and most importantly, it's affordable. We've already taken the liberty of putting down a deposit. You have 10 days to pack. The movers will be here on the 11th. 10 days, 32 years of life, reduced to a 10-day countdown." "This is my home," Evelyn said, her spine straightening, a flicker of the woman she used to be, the woman Arthur had adored for her fire, sparking in her blue eyes. "Julian, your father's office is full of his life's work. My garden. I planted those hydrangeas when you were in kindergarten." "Hydrangeas don't pay the IRS, Evelyn," Tiffany snapped. "Julian is the executor of the estate. He has the authority to make these calls. We're doing this for you. We don't want you to end up destitute." The betrayal cut deeper than the grief. Julian, the boy she had stayed up with through fevers, the man whose education she had funded by selling her own family's heirloom jewelry when Arthur's business was starting out, he was nodding in agreement with a woman who looked at Evelyn as if she were an outdated piece of furniture. That night, alone in the vast master bedroom, Evelyn didn't cry. The shock had transitioned into a cold, hard clarity. She walked to Arthur's study, a room Julian and Tiffany had already begun inventorying by slapping yellow sticky notes on his antique drafting table and leather-bound books. She sat in Arthur's chair, the scent of him still lingering in the leather. She ran her fingers along the underside of the mahogany desk, a nervous habit she'd had for decades. Her fingers caught on something, a small recessed notch that shouldn't have been there. With a click, a small drawer popped open. Inside was a rosewood music box, one Arthur had gifted her on their 5th anniversary. It played a tinkling, melancholic version of Moon River. But when Evelyn lifted the velvet lining of the box, she didn't find a necklace. She found a heavy, old-fashioned brass key and a piece of vellum paper, folded neatly. It was a hand-drawn map of the Gaston Street house, sketched with Arthur's unmistakable architectural precision. But it wasn't a floor plan. It was a map of voids, the spaces between the walls, the hidden hollows that most people never noticed. In the center of the library, Arthur had drawn a small red X behind the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Underneath, in his elegant script, he had written, "For my Evelyn, when the walls start to close in, remember that I built this house to be your fortress, not your cage. Don't trust what the eyes see. Trust what my hands built." Evelyn's heart raced. Arthur had always been a man of few words, preferring to express his love through the structures he created. He had known. Somehow he had seen the cracks in their son's character, or perhaps the predator lurking behind Tiffany's polished exterior. The next few days were a blur of downsizing. Tiffany was relentless, walking through the house with a professional appraiser, pointing at Evelyn's favorite paintings and asking, "Does this have a certificate of authenticity?" Julian stayed in the background, busy on his phone, looking stressed and haggard. Evelyn watched him closely. She noticed the way he flinched whenever Tiffany raised her voice. She noticed the expensive new watch on his wrist, a stark contrast to his claims of financial ruin. On the 3rd night, while Julian and Tiffany were out at a business dinner, likely celebrating their impending windfall, Evelyn went to the library. She moved the heavy ladder to the 3rd section of the shelves, where Arthur kept his collection of rare architectural journals. Following the map, she pressed a specific sequence of carved decorative moldings. With a low mechanical groan, a section of the shelving swung inward. It wasn't a dusty closet. It was a high-tech, climate-controlled vault. Inside were rows of filing cabinets, a small safe, and a single computer terminal. Evelyn spent the entire night reading. What she found made the blood in her veins turn to ice. Arthur's business wasn't failing. In fact, it had been more profitable in the last 5 years than ever before. But the money wasn't in the corporate accounts Julian had access to. Arthur had been systematically diverting the profits into a private trust, an anonymous legacy trust with Evelyn as the sole beneficiary. But there was more. Arthur had kept meticulous files on Julian and Tiffany. He had hired investigators. Evelyn opened a blue folder labeled Julian Debt Obligations. Inside were records of Julian's failed tech startup, not just the failure, but the fraud. Julian had embezzled funds from his own investors to pay for Tiffany's lavish lifestyle, and Tiffany had been the one to forge the documents, making it look like Julian was the sole culprit. She was holding it over his head, a leash of legal fire that kept him obedient. Then Evelyn found the most devastating piece of evidence. Tiffany wasn't just a greedy daughter-in-law, she was a professional. She had a history under a different name in Nevada, a trail of wealthy older men who had died shortly after marrying her, leaving her their estates. Arthur had been building a case. He was days away from taking this to the authorities when his heart had given out. Evelyn sat on the floor of the secret vault, the cold light of the computer screen illuminating the tears she finally allowed to fall. Arthur hadn't just died. He had been a soldier in a war she didn't even know was being fought. She looked at the brass key in her hand. It didn't fit the safe in the vault. It was tagged with a small GPS coordinate and a name, the Carmel Sanctuary. Evelyn Vance stood up, wiping her eyes. She was no longer a grieving widow. She was the owner of the Vance legacy, and she was the only thing standing between her son and a woman who made a living out of erasing people. 10 days, Tiffany, Evelyn whispered to the empty room, her voice echoing with a newfound iron. You think you're moving an old woman out of her home, but you're just giving me time to finish what Arthur started. The first twist was clear. Evelyn wasn't broke. She was, quite possibly, one of the wealthiest women in Savannah. And the second twist was beginning to take shape in her mind. Julian wasn't the villain. He was the next victim. As the sun began to rise over the Gaston Street mansion, Evelyn Vance walked back to her bedroom, past the yellow sticky notes, and for the first time in a week, she slept soundly. The war had begun, and she finally had the map to win it. The next 48 hours in the Gaston Street mansion were a masterclass in psychological warfare, though Tiffany was too arrogant to realize she was no longer the one pulling the strings. Evelyn moved through the house with a newfound quiet grace that Tiffany mistook for defeated resignation. "I've arranged for a local auction house to come by on Friday," Tiffany announced over breakfast, spreading marmalade on her toast with clinical precision. "Most of this heavy Victorian furniture won't fit in your new apartment, Evelyn. It's better to just let it go. We'll put the proceeds toward your transition fund." Evelyn sipped her tea, her eyes tracing the familiar patterns of the crown molding Arthur had hand-carved. "Friday seems so soon, Tiffany. But I suppose you're right. Things are just... things." Julian flinched, his coffee cup clattering against the saucer. He looked terrible, dark circles under his eyes, a nervous twitch in his left cheek. He hadn't looked at his mother directly for days. Every time he tried, Tiffany would place a possessive hand on his shoulder, a silent reminder of the legal fire she held over his head. "That's the spirit, Mother," Julian muttered, his voice hollow. "It's about a fresh start." "A fresh start," Evelyn echoed, her voice devoid of emotion. As soon as they left for the day, Tiffany to meet with a financial planner and Julian to his supposed office, Evelyn returned to the secret vault. She wasn't looking for more money. She was looking for a weapon. She found it in a digital folder encrypted with her birthday. Inside were audio recordings Arthur had made in the weeks leading up to his death. Her hand trembled as she pressed play. "Evelyn, if you're hearing this, the worst has happened." Arthur's voice filled the small room, warm and steady. "I discovered that Tiffany has been microdosing my evening tea with digitalis. Not enough to kill a man instantly, but enough to make his heart struggle. She thinks I'm oblivious. She thinks I'm just an old man fading away. But I've been recording the kitchen cameras. I've seen her swap the canisters." Evelyn gasped, clutching her throat. It wasn't just neglect. It was slow-motion murder. "I've secured the house through a shell company called a V Sanctuary Holdings," Arthur continued. "The deed Julian thinks is in the safe is a dummy. The real title is held by the trust. Evelyn, they will try to break you. They will try to make you feel small. Do not let them. You are the architect now." The weight of the betrayal was staggering, but Evelyn didn't crumble. She spent the afternoon making 3 phone calls. The first was to James Sterling, Arthur's old legal bulldog, a man who had retired to the coast but owed Arthur his life. The second was to a high-end private security firm. The third was to an old friend in the Savannah Police Department. Friday arrived with a deceptive southern sun. The air was thick with the scent of magnolias and the impending storm of a family's destruction. Tiffany arrived at 10 a.m., accompanied by 2 men in overalls from Savannah's finest auctions and a woman who looked like a predatory bird, a realtor specializing in distressed luxury properties. "All right, boys," Tiffany barked, pointing to the grand mahogany dining table. "Start with the dining room. Evelyn, have you finished packing your personal bag? The car for the senior community will be here at noon." Evelyn was sitting in Arthur's wingback chair in the parlor, a simple strand of pearls around her neck. She looked like a portrait of old-world dignity. "I've changed my mind, Tiffany. I'm not leaving." The room went silent. The auctioneers paused, looking awkwardly at each other. Tiffany let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Evelyn, dear, we've been through this. The grief is making you confused. You don't have a choice. The house is being sold. Julian has signed the papers as the executor." "Julian," Evelyn said, her voice soft but carrying a resonance that stopped her son in his tracks as he walked through the front door. "Is that true? Have you sold your father's soul?" Julian looked at Tiffany, then at the floor. "Mom, we have to. The debts." "What debts, Julian?" Evelyn stood up, her movement fluid and commanding. "The $200,000 you borrowed from your investors that ended up in Tiffany's offshore account in the Caymans? Or the debts Tiffany told you existed while she was systematically draining your father's business accounts?" Tiffany's face transformed. The mask of the helpful daughter-in-law shattered, revealing a cold, jagged edge. "Enough of this nonsense. Movers, take the table, now." "Touch that table," a deep voice boomed from the foyer, "and I'll have you charged with grand larceny." James Sterling stepped into the room, looking every bit the legal assassin he was reputed to be. He was followed by 2 uniformed men who stood by the door. "Who are you?" Tiffany demanded, her voice rising an octave. "I am the legal representative for AV Sanctuary Holdings," James said, sliding a silver-embossed folder onto the coffee table. "The actual owner of this property, and I have here a cease and desist order for any sale or removal of assets from this house." Tiffany grabbed the papers, her eyes darting over the legal jargon. "This is fake. Julian is the heir." "Julian is the heir to his father's personal effects," James countered calmly. "But his father didn't own this house at the time of his death. The trust did. And the sole trustee and beneficiary of that trust is Mrs. Evelyn Vance." Julian's face went white. "Mom? What is he talking about?" "Arthur knew Julian," Evelyn said, walking over to her son. She felt a pang of pity for him, but she didn't let it soften her. "He knew Tiffany was blackmailing you with those forged documents. He knew she was the one who set up the fraud at your company to keep you under her thumb." "You don't know anything!" Tiffany screamed, stepping toward Evelyn. "Julian, tell her! Tell her you're the executor!" "He's not the executor of anything that matters, Tiffany," James Sterling interrupted. "In fact, Julian, your mother has just finished purchasing your outstanding debt from your investors. Legally, you don't owe the bank anymore. You owe her. $96,000 with interest." The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently it was almost physical. Tiffany looked like a cornered animal. She realized her leverage over Julian, the threat of jail for his fraud, was gone. Evelyn now held the keys to his prison. "You think you've won?" Tiffany spat, her eyes burning with hatred. "You're still just an old woman in a big house. We'll contest the trust. We'll tie you up in court for years." "I don't think so," Evelyn said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. She pressed play. Arthur's voice filled the room, describing the digitalis in his tea. Tiffany's bravado vanished. She took a step back, her eyes darting toward the door. "The police are on their way, Tiffany," Evelyn said, her voice like cold steel. "Not for the house, for the exhumation order. We're going to find out exactly what was in Arthur's system the night he died." In the chaos that followed, Tiffany didn't wait for the police. She grabbed her designer bag and bolted through the kitchen door, disappearing into the maze of Savannah's side streets. She was a pro. She knew when a mark had turned into a predator. Julian sank onto the stairs, burying his face in his hands. "Mom, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about the medicine. I was so scared of going to jail." Evelyn looked at her son. She wanted to hold him, but the image of him nodding as Tiffany told her to pack her bags was still fresh. "Scared enough to throw your mother to the wolves, Julian?" "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't pay the mortgage, Julian, and it doesn't bring your father back." Evelyn turned to James Sterling. "Clear them out. The auctioneers, the realtor, everyone. I want my house back." By sunset, the Gaston Street mansion was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the hollow ache of grief, but the heavy stillness of a fortress after a siege. Evelyn sat in the library, the secret vault door closed. She held the brass key to the Carmel sanctuary. She had won the house, but she realized she didn't want it anymore. Every corner was stained with the memory of Tiffany's cruelty and Julian's weakness. She opened the file James had brought her. It contained the final twist of the day. As Evelyn studied the map for the Carmel property in California, she realized it wasn't just a retirement cottage. It was a multi-million-dollar oceanfront estate that Arthur had purchased 3 years ago, but there was a note attached to the deed in Arthur's handwriting. For Evelyn and Julian, if he finds his way back. If not, for Evelyn and the women who need a place where the walls don't talk. Arthur had been planning an exit for both of them. He had seen the darkness in Tiffany long ago and had built a literal sanctuary on the other side of the country. Evelyn looked at Julian, who was still sitting on the stairs, looking broken. "Julian," she called out. He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "The police will find Tiffany eventually," Evelyn said, "and James will handle the debt you owe me. But you aren't staying here, and you aren't coming with me. Mom, please. You need to learn what it means to be a Vance, Julian. It means building things that last, not tearing them down for a quick fix. You will work. You will pay back every cent of that $96,000, and maybe in a few years I'll tell you where I am." The strength in her own voice surprised her. For decades, she had been the graceful wife, the supportive mother. She had let the men in her life build the walls around her. But Arthur had given her the ultimate gift. He had shown her that she was the one who held the blueprints all along. The next morning, Evelyn Vance walked out of the Gaston Street house with a single suitcase and a brass key. She didn't look back at the Victorian beauty or the weeping man in the foyer. She had a date with the Pacific Ocean. She had a legacy to protect. And she had a story to tell to all the women who had been told they were disposable once their hair turned silver. As she boarded the plane for California, Evelyn took out her tablet. She began to type. Not a diary, but a manifesto. How to build a fortress when your world collapses. The Vance legacy wasn't just a house or a trust. It was the fire in her blood. And Evelyn Vance was just getting started. The rhythm of the Pacific waves crashing against the jagged granite cliffs of Carmel, California, carried a melody entirely different from the stifling, moss-draped silence of Savannah. Here the air was crisp, salted by the sea and whipped by winds that felt as though they were scrubbing away the grime of betrayal. Evelyn Vance stood on the expansive wraparound deck of the sanctuary, a modern architectural marvel of glass, steel, and stone that Arthur had secretly commissioned years ago. The house didn't boast the heavy, ornate history of the Gaston Street mansion. Instead, it embraced the landscape, transparent yet unyielding. This wasn't a place to hide. It was a place to see clearly. 6 months had passed since the afternoon Evelyn walked out of Georgia. In that time, she hadn't spent a single day in idle mourning. With James Sterling's ironclad legal maneuvers, Evelyn had transitioned the oversight of Henderson Construction to Tom Bradley. She didn't lead from the front lines. She led through encrypted video calls and spreadsheets. But her primary project wasn't construction. It was justice. Tiffany Vance, who was currently drifting through high-end resorts under the alias Isabella Rossi, hadn't vanished as easily as a ghost. She was a predator, and predators are creatures of habit. After fleeing Savannah, she had drained a hidden account in Florida and settled into a luxury villa in Scottsdale, Arizona, posing as a young widow looking for investment opportunities. Tiffany believed Evelyn was a frail old woman who would be content with her seaside cottage and her grief. She was tragically mistaken. Evelyn had used a portion of her trust to hire the same investigators Arthur had once used. She didn't call the police immediately. She wanted Tiffany to feel the walls closing in, to experience the slow, suffocating dread she had once inflicted on Arthur. Send her a gift, Evelyn told her lead investigator over a secure line. The next day in Scottsdale, Tiffany received a courier package. Inside was no letter, only an empty vial of digitalis and a high-resolution photograph of Arthur's headstone. Tiffany understood the message instantly. I see you. Panic began to erode Tiffany's polished exterior. She began to move, Arizona to Nevada, then down toward the Mexican border. But everywhere she went, a subtle reminder appeared. A restaurant bill paid in the name of Vance, a single jasmine flower, Evelyn's favorite, placed on her hotel pillow. Tiffany, desperate and nearly broke from the cost of constant flight, made one final reckless move. She believed that if she could confront Evelyn directly at the Carmel estate, she could use the remaining secrets about Julian's past to extort a final payout. On a late afternoon, as the sky over the Pacific turned a bruised, violent purple, Tiffany appeared at the sanctuary. She was no longer the sleek socialite. Her eyes were hollow, her designer clothes wrinkled and worn. She slipped through a back service entrance she assumed was a weak point. But Evelyn was waiting in the great room, silhouetted against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. You took your time getting here, Tiffany, Evelyn said, her voice steady and calm, not even bothering to turn around. Tiffany pulled a small silver handgun from her clutch, her hand trembling. You think you're so smart, don't you? You ruined my life. Julian is rotting in some flyover town, and you're sitting here in a glass castle playing God. Evelyn turned slowly, her gaze cool and unafraid. The money Arthur left was meant to protect what is worthy. You were never worthy. Give me $5 million and a new passport or I'll kill you right here, Tiffany shrieked. The police will think you finally snapped. A grieving widow jumping into the surf. Evelyn smiled, a thin, sharp expression of absolute power. You're still thinking like a small-time grifter, Tiffany. Look at the walls. The glass panels of the room suddenly flickered to life, transforming into high-definition displays. Dozens of camera angles from the house, the perimeter, and even the dash cams of the cars that had followed Tiffany across state lines appeared. Every word you've said, every inch of your forced entry, is being streamed live to the FBI field office in San Francisco. Evelyn said, stepping closer. Arthur built this house with an integrated security lattice that registers even a change in air pressure. You didn't break in. I unlocked the door for you. The distant, mournful wail of sirens began to rise over the sound of the ocean. Tiffany collapsed, the gun clattering onto the hardwood floor. She realized then that she had never been playing against Evelyn. She had been playing against the combined brilliance of a man who built fortresses and a woman who had finally learned how to live in one. After Tiffany was hauled away to face federal charges ranging from attempted murder to interstate fraud, Evelyn received one last visitor. Julian arrived a month later. He had lost weight, his skin bronzed from outdoor labor. His hands, once only used to sign checks, were now rough and calloused. He didn't ask for a handout. He carried a heavy manila envelope. "This is the first $15,000, Mother," Julian said, his voice gravelly and humble. "I've been working a ranch in Montana. This is my wages and the money from the sale of everything I owned." Evelyn looked at her son. For the first time in a decade, she saw the boy she had raised, before the shadow of greed had dimmed his spirit. "Sit down, Julian." She slid a final document across the table. It was the last report from James Sterling. The final twist was a gut punch of grace. Arthur hadn't died just because of the poison or a weak heart. Arthur had known he had terminal, inoperable cancer months before Tiffany ever started dosing his tea. He had used his own impending death as a masterstroke. He let Tiffany believe she was winning so that she would grow careless, allowing him to document her crimes and create a legal minefield that would protect Evelyn and force Julian to find his own soul. A handwritten note from Arthur was attached. "Evelyn, I chose to go out on my own terms. I needed her to think she was the architect of my end so that she would reveal her hand. Julian needed to lose the world to find himself. If he is reading this, it means he has finally earned the right to be a Vance." Julian wept, the sound of his grief echoing through the glass house. He realized his father had used his final breath to build a bridge for his son to walk back across. Evelyn didn't take Julian's money for herself. Instead, she used it to fund the first wing of the Vance Foundation at the Carmel estate. She transformed the sanctuary into a high-level retreat for women over 60 who had been victims of familial harvesting. Women who had been told they were disposable, whose children or spouses had tried to erase them. She hired James Sterling as the primary legal counsel. She taught these women how to read a balance sheet, how to structure a trust, and how to build a fortress within their own minds. Her story went viral, but not as a victim's tale. She became a symbol of the Silver Uprising. Julian wasn't given a seat at the table immediately. He was hired as a junior administrator at the foundation, working under the strict, watchful eye of James Sterling. He had to prove his worthiness every single day, one honest hour of labor at a time. One evening, Evelyn sat on her deck, watching the sunset melt into the Pacific. She took out Arthur's old recorder and played the very last message. "Evelyn, the most beautiful house isn't built of stone or glass. It's the one you build in your heart, where no one can ever evict you. I was just the draftsman. You were always the one meant to finish the build. Live, Evelyn. Live for both of us." She raised her glass of wine to the horizon. She wasn't just a widow from Savannah anymore. She was the master architect of her own destiny. Freedom, she realized, wasn't just having enough money to leave. It was having the strength to stay and demand the respect you deserved. As the light faded, Evelyn Vance smiled. The legacy was secure, the debt was being paid, and for the first time in her life, the walls around her were exactly where they were supposed to be.